Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. As he said, I am Jennifer Allen, a fourth-year PhD student here at MIT Sloan School of Management in the marketing group. And today I'm going to present a project about how polarization can help solve the misinformation problem. This is joint work with my collaborators, Cameron Martel, and my advisor, Dave Rand, and draws upon the work of our lab in general, the HCL lab, many of which I have presented here. And so the background of this talk really is two different problems facing society today. And the first is a rise in political polarization. And so, as mentioned in this article here, political sectarianism or political polarization has been on the rise in the US. And this is out-party hate, dislike of the other group, and partisanship in general. And the other problem simultaneously facing society is the rise in misinformation, particularly online misinformation. And so, starting with the 2016 election, but of course also including the COVID-19 pandemic and the infodemics surrounding that, as well as the 2020 US presidential election, which was widely allocated to have been stolen, of course, totally falsely, and continuing to be an issue today, as we were just talking about with ChatGPT, and other avenues to increase the spread of online misinformation. So again, this really continues to be a problem from 2016 to now. And so this question of how we combat this misinformation that is spreading online is one that has been a huge focus for us in our lab. And the solution that I'm going to present is actually related to the problem that I talked about earlier, which is this rise of political polarization and negative partisanship in the US. And again, it's usually thought of as this problem, threatening democracy. And of course, there are a lot of issues with the rise of partisanship. But one silver lining that I'm going to talk about today is that it can be harnessed to help combat this misinformation problem. And the way that I'm going to talk about how it can be harnessed is really partisanship can be a really powerful motivator. It's can be a real threat to society, but also it can be motivation for good. And in the context that I'm going to talk about it today is in the context of crowdsourced fact checking. And so how do we actually get volunteer fact checkers to participate? Well, we're going to harness some of this political polarization that I talked about earlier. But before I can really dive into that work, I'm going to give a little bit of background about what the current status of fighting misinformation on platforms really is. And so, in our overloaded information environment, the typical way that platforms have deployed fighting misinformation is through third-party fact checkers, like Snopes here, which is a US-based fact checker that debunks rumors and other types of misinformation, particularly online. And platforms, when a story is flagged by third-party fact checkers, platforms can then take action. They can demote that content or put a warning label on that content. And that has been, a pretty successful method when it's correctly deployed in reducing people's belief in misinformation and the spread of misinformation. And so, there's pretty wide evidence that when these labels or a demotion happens, it's effective in curbing the misinformation problem. However, there's a problem, and that's the amount of fact-checking that's going on is really a drop in the bucket when it comes to the vastness of the misinformation ecosystem, or the information ecosystem generally. And so, this is actually saying that despite the issue of misinformation that we're facing today, the number of new fact-checking projects has actually gone down. There's been less investment in those fact-checking projects. And for example, in the lead up to the 2020 election, fact checkers were only able to, on Facebook, were only able to fact check 200 pieces of content leading into that election, which we know is a drop in the bucket when it comes to, the vastness of the information ecosystem, as particularly around contentious things like elections. And so there's a huge problem with scale, even though we might, like the work that fact checkers are doing, there's simply not enough of that work. And so how do we actually identify misinformation at scale? And that is really the issue that's facing platforms today. And one way that our lab has really talked about and is the focus of a lot of my work is by using the wisdom of crowds. And so for those who might not be familiar, the wisdom of crowds is a phenomenon by which individual judgments of lay people can be aggregated together. And when they're aggregated together, those judgment, their average judgment actually can match or even exceed the performance of experts or professionals. And so this, kind of famous story that is in the background is about, comes from this paper by Galton, from 1906, about a county fair where there was a guess the weight of the ox game, and each individual person playing the game was wildly off in their guess of how much the ox weighed. But when you average together the entire crowd's guesses, they were just 1 pound away from the true weight of the ox. And so, there's power in numbers, and, we are more the sum of our parts. And this phenomenon has been shown to be really powerful in the context of things like forecasting or even reading radiology scans. And actually, it turned out to be, really powerful in the context of crowdsourced fact checking as well. And so this is a paper, this is a plot from a paper that came out in 2021 about crowdsourced fact checking, where we found that small crowds of size 10 to 15 rating the veracity of headlines were able to match, to correlate with the fact checker ratings about as well as the fact checkers correlate with each other. And so lay people were actually able to match the performance of fact checkers when they were randomly assigned articles to fact check, and then those ratings were averaged together. And so, this is really encouraging, and we replicated this work cross-culturally in this paper coming out in the context of COVID-19 misinformation as well. And this method of using crowdsourced fact-checking and aggregating the responses has been deployed by Facebook in a product called Community Review that they're using to expand fact-checking on their platform. And so, that's all well and good, and sounds great, but there's still a problem there. So, in the context of Community Review and on our work here, we're paying people to rate this content, and even that it is not always as scalable. You might think that Meta would be able to pay a lot of people, and I think that they should pay more people, but it's still a limitation when it comes to scale. And so if instead of, we're paying people to and randomly assigning content to rate, what if instead there was a volunteer system where people could opt in to participate in a crowdsourced fact-checking system, similar to something like Wikipedia, and then actually choose what to rate? What would we expect to happen in this kind of environment? Well, first, we might worry that this environment would be vulnerable to partisan extremists. As I was mentioning, partisan extremity is on the rise. And so it's possible that partisan extremists would participate in this platform and really push their own agenda at the expense of the truth. And the second thing we'd worry about is that, no one would participate at all. Like, why would people really participate in this in a public goods platform, without payment and spend their time and energy fact-checking content? So, given a volunteer environment, what would actually motivate people to participate? And the two things that I'm going to talk about as potential motivators, again, relates to my earlier slides. And so first, you can imagine that there are some people out there who really just care about the truth, who do want to devote their time, to this public goods problem and spend their time fact-checking content. And you might think that this is, who are these people in the context of society? And in reality, most people do want accurate news feeds when we survey them, and people think it's important. And so, generally people do care about the truth. But, and we're hoping to find, these people who care about the truth so much that they are willing to participate in this volunteer program. And the second is that they might care about partisanship. And so they would want to, advance their own agenda and want to reduce counterpartisan content and boost co-partisan content, regardless of the truth. So, this is maybe the the motivation that would be most top of mind when we're thinking about these volunteer systems, and maybe would be a cause for concern about when we're thinking about why people would participate in these systems and some of the repercussions. And so given these two potential motivations, we can break down people's potential flagging behavior. And by flagging, I mean, I'm going to use flagging and fact-checking as kind of synonyms here. We can think about people's flagging behavior in two different dimensions. The first one is according to their political alignment. So whether a piece of content is concordant with their political beliefs or discordant with their political beliefs, content that they disagree with politically. And the second dimension is whether or not the content is true or not. So whether, so I mean, for simplicity's sake, we're gonna say that content can either be true or false. I think that this method would also extend to more continuous definitions of truth. But for now, just these four different categories, the different types of potential information that people could flag. And so if we imagine that people care about reducing falsehoods, we would expect them to spend their time and energy seeking out and flagging false content. And on the other hand, if people care about partisanship, we would expect them to spend their time and energy flagging discordant political information, stuff that disagrees with their political beliefs. And I think that this maybe gives us a kind of a good illustration for where this project is going, which is that really the area where these two potential motivations are combined is in the context of false discordant information. So information that disagrees with one's political views, but is and so one is then motivated to seek it out and call it out, but is also false because people, again, regardless of what people might believe, do generally care about increasing true content on platforms. And so just to formalize this model a little bit more, this is a very simple model, and I'm sure the economists in the room will have issues with it if there are any here. But just to put a little bit of formalization on it, we can think of this as where a model where the utility of flagging is a linear combination of the strength of the accuracy motive and whether or not the content that people are thinking about flagging is false, plus the strength of the partisanship motive times whether or not the piece of content is concordant or discordant. And then, of course, this -1 is that there's a cost of flagging, which is normalized to 1 without loss of generalization. And so, again, this utility that people get from flagging is a product of their accuracy motives and their partisan motives. And then we're going to use the logistic function to map this utility that people are getting from flagging to the probability that they flag a given piece of content. And so what are some of the predictions that this model gives? Well, first, that people should never really flag true concordant news. They'll never get utility from flagging news that is both true and agrees with their political beliefs. The second is as partisan motives increases, there's always going to be more bias in fact-checking, where we define bias as the number of discordant claims flagged minus the number of concordant claims flagged. And so, how much preference do you have for your own side's information? And as obvious as your partisan motive increase, this is always going to increase. But what about the effects of partisan motives on discernment? And so discernment here, we're going to define as the number of false claims flagged minus the number of true claims flagged. And so we really are looking for high discernment. We want people to be flagging more more false claims than they are true claims. And so what will partisanship, increasing partisan motivation do to this flagging behavior? And so here, this plot here has people's accuracy motives on the y-axis and people's partisan motives on the x-axis. And it's going to be colored based on this plot on the right, where bluer values correspond to higher discernment, which is again what we want, and red values correspond to worse discernment, which is again not what we want. And so if you imagine that people have a high accuracy motive, they're very motivated intrinsically to flag false content. They're saints. then increasing people's partisan motive decreases the discernment, which I think is pretty intuitive. As people's partisan motivation goes up, their willingness to fact check false concordant content goes down, and their willingness to flag true discordant content goes up. And so the discernment goes down. But if people's accuracy motives are lower, set here kind of arbitrarily to below 1, we see a different pattern, which is that as people's accuracy or people's partisan motives increase, then the discernment actually gets better to a point, because at first people are, because of the cost of flagging, people are not really flagging much false information at all, even if they have, some sort of accuracy motive. However, as the partisan motive increases, they are motivated to flag false discordant information, and so information from the other side, but they're not yet motivated to start flagging true discordant information. So they're kind of differentially motivated to only flag the false but content that they disagree with. And so, yeah, just to sum up here, exactly what I said, partisan motives always increase bias. But for discernment, as partisan motives increase, there can be a negative effect if there's a strong accuracy motive. But if there's a weak accuracy motive, there can actually be a potentially positive effect to partisanship, because people are only sufficiently motivated to flag claims that are both false and discordant, that disagree with their political beliefs. And so, this is all nice for theory, but of course we want to see some potential evidence supporting this. And so to do that, we ran an empirical test with 2,400 Americans from Lucid quota matched to the US population. And in this study, we told the participants that they were given a chance to help social media companies identify misinformation. And participants were shown a news feed and could flag articles as false or misleading, and write a short explanation as to why they believed that article was false or misleading. And this is mimicking the process that social media companies and platforms really use to flag content, or to collect user flags in their feed. And so this kind of pseudo news feed in this experiment had 30 true stimuli, half right-leaning, half left-leaning, 30 false stimuli, again, half right-leaning and half left-leaning. So again, these are these 4 buckets that I was talking about: the true, discordant, false, the true, discordant, true, false, discordant, concordant, 4 by 4 or 2 by 2. And also we have just some filler content as a kind of a control of these non-news stimuli that we call, sensational stimuli. And people were randomly assigned, or the order of this content was randomized, and it was all mixed up. We didn't enforce any order, and we observed people's flagging behavior. And so this is what this would look like. It's just a Qualtrics survey, and people could flag content and were asked to write a note explaining why they flagged that content, and asked for sources. And people had to submit some note about why they were flagging the content. Again, we're trying to raise the cost of flagging a little bit so people just wouldn't, spam. And yeah, surprisingly, some people actually did go out and really fact check this content, which is not necessarily my first. I didn't. It was a little bit unexpected for me, but yeah, some people actually really did go flag content. And, so what do we find? And so I'm going to show here the overall flagging pattern of content of each different type. So concordant false, discordant false, the sensational content that was more neutral that I talked about, and the concordant true and the discordant true content. And on the y-axis here, I'm going to have the percent of content of those headlines flagged for each person. So the average percent of content of that type that was flagged. And so what do we see? Well, for concordant false information, for false information, we see this evidence of this bias that we were talking about. People are more likely to flag discordant false information than they are to flag concordant false information. People do have this partisan bias, this preference. but they are much more likely to flag false content than they are true content. And so, as you can see here, there's really high discernment in this sample. Sensational and concordant true content are really not being flagged much at all, and discordant true content is also not really being flagged very much, although, it is being flagged more than concordant true information. But what happens when we think about partisan motives, which were measured pre-treatment? And so we operationalized partisan motives, or political engagement as in three different ways. The first was affective polarization, which we measured using a feeling thermometer, where people were asked to rate their feelings of warmth towards the out party. We had a measure of issue polarization, which is your agreement with one party's stance, on issues versus another, and just a measure of political knowledge. And the results that I'm going to show you hold for each of these partisan motives individually, but as you can imagine, they're very highly correlated. And so we ran a PCA where the first component of the PCA equally weighted all three of these different dimensions. And so we use that first component of the PCA as a measure of, general polarization or political engagement. And also in the results that I'm going to show, there are going to be controls for age, gender, race, education, and attentiveness. And so, it's not just that people who were higher political knowledge were more or higher at issue polarization or something were more attentive. We actually control for that as well. And so here I'm just going to do a median split on this first dimension, this first PCA dimension of our political engagement. And I'm going to show the same plot as before for people with low, partisan motive and versus high partisan motive. So here for people with low partisan motive, we see that there's a lower rate of flagging than before, and we don't see as much evidence of political bias. People are not in this, people with low partisan motive are not really differentiating between concordant true and discordant true information, for example. However, people with high partisan motivation, we see, one, that the rate of flagging is much higher. And so people with high partisan motivation are flagging much more content, and they're also differential, but they're also more biased. And so they're disproportionately flagging more discordant content, particularly discordant false content, but they are also, having these false positives where they are flagging more discordant true content as well. And so, so this is just what I just said earlier. And so, what does this empirical test show us? Well, as predicted, false discordant content is flagged the most, followed by false concordant content, and the rate of flagging true discordant content is very low. Discernment is very high, so people are much more likely to flag false versus true content, although the overall flag rates are low, and 31% of people didn't flag at all. And yes, and as I mentioned earlier, the more polarized subjects are more discerning. And so people who have high partisan motivation, who are more politically involved, are better at this task, largely because they're flagging and more motivated to flag false discordant content. Or that's how we're interpreting it. But of course, this is a survey in the lab. How would these results actually generalize in reality in the field? And so we might believe that, accuracy motives are stronger among survey participants. People, people want to answer, flag the false content because they want to, maybe there's some demand effects for pleasing the survey giver. And, we tell people, you don't have to flag anything at all. You're not going to be paid for extra for flagging. But, there's still a worry about potential demand effects here. And the second is that partisan motives might be weaker in a survey setting. It's kind of unclear what we're doing with these flags. So maybe people really don't have motivation to really cheerlead their side versus another side. And so with that in mind, we actually go to the field and look at actual real world examples of this kind of platform and environment. And so the field setting that we're going to look at is Twitter's Birdwatch platform. And so This is has been actually renamed in the Elon Musk era to be community notes. And so for those who are not familiar, this was a project launched by Twitter in January 2021. That was a community-driven approach to addressing misleading information online through crowdsourced fact-checking. And the way it works is that participants could apply to, anyone on Twitter really could apply to be involved in this pilot program. And if they were accepted by Twitter, they could flag tweets in their newsfeed, or really any tweets they found on the platform, as either potentially misleading or not misleading. And then they were asked to write a short note explaining their reason for flagging. And just to note, Twitter actually accepted people not entirely randomly. They accepted people who had a US phone number and were active on Twitter. And in particular, they also looked for people who came from different political sides. And so this is kind of a weirdly balanced data set between Democrats and Republicans in this early pilot of Birdwatch, which is the data that we're going to be looking at, which is maybe not representative of Twitter overall, but just something to keep in mind. And so this is kind of what it might look like. So this is an example of a tweet by Amazon that a Birdwatch participant has written a note for, flagged this focal tweet as potentially misleading, and provided some explanation for why this content is misleading. And you might wonder, how does Elon Musk feel about this? Well, he's actually a huge fan of community notes. So this project is rolling out and is actually getting more and more traction and being rolled out in different countries as well. And so important to study, I think. And so let's assess the flagging behavior in this field data. And so we're going to look at a subset of the content. Again, this is from the pilot version of Birdwatch, and Birdwatch has kind of evolved over time and is a little bit different than what you see today. And actually, what I should have mentioned earlier is, in this version of Birdwatch, people's notes were visible to other birdwatchers, but they were not yet visible to the Twitter environment at large. And so, right now, actually, anyone in the US can see, and I think some other countries as well, can see Birdwatch notes that reach, that are upvoted enough times. And so, which is really cool, but in this particular period, that was not the case. And 90% of these notes, of these flags, said that the focal tweet was potentially misleading. So this is really being used as a flagging system, similar to what we presented earlier. And we're going to focus on these because, this is, again, the vast majority of notes. And we hired 2 fact checkers to evaluate the tweets as well. And we're going to call a tweet false if either fact checker says that the tweet is potentially misleading, and it's true if both fact checkers say the tweet is not misleading. And we also had 300 checkers evaluate the partisanship of tweets, whether or not they were pro-Democrat or pro-Republican. And then we also inferred the partisanship of the tweeter using the accounts that those tweeters followed, according to the method in Pablo Barbera's 2015 paper. And so, what are people's flagging behavior? What does the flagging behavior actually look like in this field setting? And so, on the y-axis here, I have the total number of notes of that type in this kind of pilot program. And so, again, we have our familiar false discordant, false concordant, true discordant, true concordant for flag types. But also we have, and it's not super important, but just for completeness sake, these false NA and true NA types, which is if we couldn't predict the political leaning of the birdwatcher, if they weren't following enough political accounts or something like that, then they didn't get a political leaning. So what do we see? Well, as in the survey data, we see that the majority of flags are false discordant. And in fact, there are over twice as many false discordant flags as there are false concordant flags. So again, we see this pattern where people are selectively policing content across the aisle. And we don't have a lot of people without political leaning, so there's much less of those. And then when it comes to true information, it's clear that again people are demonstrating discernment here, where people are the vast majority of, or sorry, maybe not the vast majority, the majority of flags are on false content, and there's a much less level of flagging on this true content. And but again, we see evidence of this partisan bias here, where people are more likely to flag true discordant content than they are true concordant content. And so that was the overall ecosystem. But then on the individual birdwatcher level, we're going to look at their flagging behavior, and this is the average number of tweets flagged by type. And the flag rates are quite low because most birdwatchers are actually not very active in the system, as one could imagine. But again, we see a similar pattern where people on average, people are flagging false discordant content, or over the most of any type of content. So is this good? Is this pattern we're seeing evidence of this platform working? Well, 80% of the potentially misleading flags were for tweets that were also rated potentially misleading by at least one fact checker. And so, 80%, it's not 100%. And so maybe that this 20% of positives would be a problem, but it's, I think, a pretty high rate of precision given the environment. And I think it's certainly higher than maybe we expected when we went out and started looking at this data. And it seems that partisan motivations really appear to help in the system rather than hurt. And so if discordant tweets were treated the same as concordant tweets and people were flagging them at the same rates, we'd see similar agreement with fact checkers. And so people, the agreement with fact checkers isn't different from when people are flagging concordant versus discordant tweets, but we'd only have about half as many flags contributed. And so there would be much less volume in the system and much less coverage overall. And so looking at political motivations, more politically extreme users, based on the accounts that people followed, and we're putting them on this kind of left-right spectrum on like a -2 to 2 scale. And so more politically extreme users were more active, and they wrote more notes. And and also more notes were written by people who were conservative and more active, and generally who had higher newsfeed quality as well. The Hexian selection model showed that this was really driven by them participating in the platform in the first place, with them writing, the first note rather than, the long tail. And so it seems like more politically extreme users are more motivated to, participate in the platform in the first place. And there's no evidence that more politically extreme users have more or less agreement with fact checkers. And so if we think of political extremity as distance from the midpoint, the users who are most politically extreme are not disagreeing with fact checkers more. However, as one might assume, more Democrat or liberal leaning politics was associated with greater fact checker agreement. And so seems great, but of course there are potential problems with this. And I'm sure that I'm hoping in the discussion we can talk about other potential problems that people see and potential solutions for them. So first, the precision seems pretty high, but of course the rate of missing problem tweets is unknown. We don't know what people chose not to flag, and so that's of course an issue with this field data. We don't have the counterfactual. Of course, the second thing is, in an asymmetric political or social context, political misinformation on one side will be missed more than misinformation on the other side. If it's really one side that's spreading most of the information, but Twitter is basically kind of artificially balancing this environment, then one side might be over-policed and the other side might be under-policed. And so, this question of how do we protect minorities from the tyranny of the majority in this kind of crowdsourced fact-checking system is, of course, cause for concern. One way that people have proposed that seems interesting, but I'm not talking about here, but there's a lot of interesting work around, is this concept of bridging algorithms, where content has to be upvoted by people from both sides, both right-leaning and left-leaning for it to really be, for example, shown, for a note to be really shown in newsfeed, in the Twitter newsfeed. And also, this system has, people are motivated, it seems, to flag political content, but they're not really as motivated to flag other type of content. And so the vast majority of tweets in Birdwatch were about politics. And so this is using topic models to classify these tweets, or COVID, and very, very few tweets about other topics, which might be socially relevant as well. Of course, we're always worried about, one bad apple spoils the bunch. And so a small number of bad actors could do substantial damage in this environment, even though if on average, most people care about the truth. And so one way to counter that could be, there's a meta layer actually on Birdwatch, which I didn't really talk about, but is a big source of research for them, where people can upvote or downvote each flag or note on whether or not it's helpful. And so if content, these bad actors could downvote appropriate flags and post and upvote inappropriate flags. And a potential solution here is that there could be a reputation mechanism where people need to earn the right to have one's votes counted and viewed. And this is, again, something that Birdwatch is doing. And you could imagine that the positive signal is a fact check is upvoted by people from the other side. And so people are, able to write notes that, both sides can agree are informative. This isn't, of course, a perfect solution, but this is the direction that Birdwatch is headed. Okay, and just to conclude, sorry, perhaps a little bit over time. Professional fact checking can't keep up with, the deluge of information in our information environments. But the wisdom of crowds can help platforms identify misinformation at scale. And so this is one way that we can combat the scale of misinformation. However, there's a public goods problem. Why would people even participate in these crowd ratings at all? And one solution to this public goods problem is if you could harness people's political motivations, that could help drive good contributions to platforms. However, platforms should search for zealots to exclude, and you want to exclude the most extreme people rather than demanding that everyone be a nonpartisan saint. And future work in this area should explore reputation mechanisms and other ways to, identify these partisan zealots or these people who are, kind of spoiling the balance of the system. And with that, I'll finish. And I'm really looking forward to any feedback anyone has or questions or any kind of discussion.